This week we'll be learning about the politics of death both in the past and today, which will involve a consideration of how and why dead bodies are incorporated into politics, and some examples of political uses of death. So what are the politics of death? Well, as we've seen in both burial and mortuary rituals, death plays out amongst the living. And so when it comes to that, some of the questions we might be asking ourselves are, what are the ways in which death is used politically? For example, killings or murders, wars, the death of different leaders or other public demonstrations. Who is in charge of marshaling the resources for any kind of funeral ceremonies? Who's going to gain prestige for taking on this responsibility? What kind of resources are they gathering? And then lastly, in what ways is death experienced by people? So how does death influence or motivate people? Well, politics, as defined by Verdery, is a form of concerted activity among social actors, often involving stakes in particular goals. And now those goals can be quite varied. They could involve making policy, justifying different actions that have been taken, claiming authority and/or disputing the authority claims of others, and lastly, creating or manipulating the cultural categories within which activities are pursued. When it comes to dead bodies, they help us to see political transformation as something more than a technical process. Death or dead bodies provoke feelings, emotions, meanings, dealing with the sacred, ideas of mortality and morality, as well as the non-rational. Now, Verdery was particularly interested in the role of socialism in the Soviet Union, and in his perspective, political legitimization, regime building are rather stagnant terms. He actually sees this as a process of reordering the meaningful universe rather than, completely legitimizing politics in and of themselves. Now, this might be interesting to consider, especially after last week's module. We talked a little bit about the social lives of human remains themselves. Well, let's take now a look at the political lives of dead bodies. This was especially an important concept in the past. What this involves, though, is an understanding of the materiality of the body. So a body's materiality is essential to its symbolic efficacy. A corpse can be moved around, displayed, strategically located, and its existence in and of itself allows for the localization of different claims. So you think about territoriality when it comes to these large mounds that are found throughout northwestern Europe. This was a way of sort of marking who lived where and legitimizing power in that way. The dead body then is meaningful through culturally established relations to death and the construction of a dead person's importance. And that construction can take on different meanings to different people. That means both within and outside of that society. So hopefully that term materiality is familiar to you from last week. It deals with the influence of material objects in daily life. So if you remember, we took a look at some of the bog bodies, and we're asking ourselves, do objects have agency? So this rope or the noose around this person's neck in the photo here, does it have any kind of agency? Is it acting on the environment or acting on different sorts of people? So for this week's purposes, though, we're looking at political transformations in the body. So bodies being used as symbols of political order through both the display of bodies themselves, but also through their destruction. Political transformation can be symbolized through the manipulation of the body. For example, the destruction of this statue of Saddam Hussein in Iraq from back in April of 2003, that's a very symbolic sort of gesture to be deposing a leader, not only politically, but also physically in terms of their representations within different cities and within the society. We see this in the past as well. This is an example of one of these colossal Olmec heads that were in Mesoamerica from approximately 1400 to 400 BCE. This is some of the first large-scale construction of monuments within Mesoamerica and were on display within public spaces. It provides a really good example of the political transformation through the manipulation of monuments. We found several of these throughout the Olmec heartland, which you see depicted here in the Gulf of Mexico. There's actually, pretty surprising amount of consistency in the depiction of what have been interpreted as these leaders through time and across a pretty wide area. But near the end of the Olmec, we've interpreted the evidence at least to suggest, this sort of pitting that you're seeing on the image on the right is associated with like purposeful defacement or the destruction of these monuments, again, as a symbol of power, as a symbol of the political structure and the leadership that had been in existence. So we see this as sort of a symbolic interpretation of what was actually happening in the past. The ambiguity of death itself can be quite powerful. Corpses suggest complex lived lives, but can't actually speak themselves. They can be spoken for, or they can be quoted out of context, for example. But there's a universal recognition of importance and familiarity with human death. So one historical example is the two different burials of Ermei Nagy, who was the Hungarian Communist Prime Minister. He was originally hanged in 1958 for his attempts to reform socialism, and at that time was buried in an unmarked grave, face down. Now, he was later exhumed and reburied with a celebration in 1989, so this could be an attempt, sort of to rewrite history. The media, however, could not really come to consensus on what this reburial meant. There were 5 sorts of ideas that were out there. The first being that, he's on display as a nationalist hero, a symbol of the nation. Second would be religious images depicting him as a martyr. Third, communist depictions suggesting him as a man of the people and, deserving of this sort of humane reburial. Fourth was the symbol of this younger generation whose life was lost in this premature killing that took place. And then lastly, ideas of truth, consequence, and rehabilitation of one's character. In the end, something to keep in mind, though, is the mark of a good political death has legitimizing effects not because everyone agrees on its meaning, but because it compels interest despite divergent views of what it means. Dead bodies tend to evoke the awe, uncertainty, and fear associated with cosmic concerns, such as the meaning of life and death. This is especially true in times of upheaval. Corpses can equate political issues with the universal notion of life and death. Religious associations may incorporate the realm of the sacred, and bodies are seen as self-referential, so all people have bodies, and to see one evokes this sort of experience, you start reflecting on what your own death might be like, or the death of your loved ones. And then there are notions of kinship and proper burial tied to bodies that deal with sort of cosmic questions and ordering of the universe. So why would you manipulate dead bodies? Well, if they're seen as political symbols, then corpses allow social actors to accumulate symbolic capital. And by symbolic capital, what I mean are resources available to an individual on the basis of honor, prestige, or recognition, and that serve as value one holds within that particular culture. So, for example, a war hero taking a candidate's side in a particular political election. And so this is where we'll pick up then from in the next lecture, which is where going to involve our discussion of politics and the use of death in politics in the past. Excuse me.